So how many of you all know what this is? You can say it out loud. Yeah, a Jenga game. Okay, most of us know what it is. Most of us have played it. How many of you all at some point have played Jenga? Yeah, most people. Okay, for those who haven't, it's easy to play. I'm going to quickly explain it to you, and it will lead to some deeper theological point in a few moments. But what you do is you have these tiny little rectangular wooden blocks. And the point of the game is to build the Jenga tower as high as possible, and that's how you win the game. And so a player will carefully being the key word, will pull a wooden block out and put it on top. And then the next player will do the same thing. They'll pull a block out, again, carefully, and they'll put it on top. And that goes back and forth and back and forth. The players go back and forth trying to be the one that does not make the whole tower topple, okay? But the problem becomes that with every block that is pulled out, the base, the tower, becomes more and more unstable. And so you can imagine how the higher up it gets, with every move, the whole thing can fall down, the whole thing can topple, and you don't want to be the one that makes it topple. And so at this point, you might wonder why I'm talking about Jenga in a sermon today. Well, I believe, ironically, that a Jenga tower poignantly illustrates what happens when people in the world have significant amounts of power and authority. To stay on top, to keep all that power, to keep all that you've gained and built in life, you have to accept that it all might topple, it all might come crumbling down at any moment. In fact, the taller that it gets, the more likely it is to fall. And so someone with lots of power and authority would inevitably live, I think, with fear and apprehension. And any move or perceived move against them becomes a threat that would lead them to erratic and even violent behavior. And so it was with Herod Antipas, the Herod in today's gospel. He knew what it was to have this kind of power. And while he wasn't a king, he did rule much of the Roman Empire. And his values stood in direct opposition to the values that Jesus taught and lived. And if any allegiance was to be given, Herod expected it to be given to Rome, not to God. And so it's understandable, I think, that Herod would feel threatened by a man who'd been gaining notoriety, a man whom people have been following, a man who had been known, who had become known for healings and miracles, a man who people claimed was the king of the Jews. It's understandable, I think, that Herod would feel threatened that his whole world and all the power that he had built would come toppling down. But Jesus, he wasn't intimidated by people like Herod Antipas. He knew his divine purpose, and he was resolute in following the path that lay before him. And that path would lead Jesus right into Jerusalem, the city that he says kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. And as we know, this same fate would find Jesus in that city, Jerusalem. This gospel, for me, is a deep theological look at that dichotomy between the way of the world and the way of God. The way of the world says to cling to power, to find a way to climb to the top, to get all that you can while you can and at any cost. Even as children, we're taught to gain as much as we can in life, to do as well as we can in school, to get the most accolades, to succeed in activities and sports. Then we're taught to get the best college education possible, to land the best job, to make lots of money, to buy the nicest house, to take the nicest vacations, to own the most expensive car. In essence, we're taught over and over again in life to have the best life and the best things that we can have. The way of the world says to get more, to build that Jenga tower higher and higher, because that's how you win, right? You win in life by staying on top. You win when everything holds up and nothing causes your life to topple and fall down. And then we have the way of God. The way of God led Jesus to live a life of love, of sacrifice, of forgiveness and peace, and even of humiliation. A life like this wouldn't make sense to Herod Antipas. In fact, I think often it doesn't make sense to us still today. Jesus didn't see Herod as a threat because Jesus knew that his place wasn't on top. And if we continue to use this Jenga tower as a metaphor, Jesus knew that he wasn't called to be one of these wooden blocks on top. He was called to be one of those blocks on the bottom. And that meant that when the ways of the world became too unstable, when the ways of violence and corruption and lies and division, when those ways failed, Jesus knew that all of that sin would come falling down upon him. And he knew that it would even kill him. But Jesus also knew that this indeed was the only way to reconcile a fallen humanity back to God. The cross may have been Jesus' destiny and his fate, but it was also meant to expose all of the evil intentions of humanity. Again, Jesus knew his divine purpose. He knew that death awaited him in Jerusalem, and he lamented about that city. He lamented about a people and a place that God wanted to speak to, that God wanted to heal. And Jesus lamented that they didn't want to accept God's message. But part of his purpose was to expose the ways that people had become captive to power and indifferent to truth. And Jesus knew that this cycle, the cycle of humanity, the cycle of abuse and power and arrogance, the things that humanity did to one another, these cycles of sin had to fall down. And these cycles of sin, they continue today in our own lives. And ultimately, I think there are times when everything needs to fall down. To live a life trying to get more and more will ultimately leave you empty. We spend so much of life trying to fill up on earthly things, and the way of God tells us to empty ourselves, that we then might be filled with God. I think when we build ourselves up like that tower, that it must, at some point, come crumbling down. Because I think that's the only way that God can build us back up into something redeemed and holy and beautiful. When we let go of power and wealth and control and influence, it's then that we can be healed. And this is what it means to be a disciple. This is what it means to follow the way of God. To let go. to let it all fall down, to not play the game as the world wants us to play it. Now, games obviously can be good and fun and healthy, like Jenga. But when life imitates a game, when life becomes about competition and about gaining and keeping power, then it becomes unhealthy. Then we fail to live as Jesus taught us, with love and humility and sacrifice. The way of God is antithetical to the world. And if we follow this path, we will likely fall down. All the pieces, all that we've built our life on, at some point may come toppling down. But to be a disciple is about falling down and letting go of all the things that we've clung to, letting go of all the things that we seek purpose and value in. Being a disciple is about letting go and falling down. But in falling down, we will find healing and new life. Amen.